Okay, everybody, it's 12 o'clock, so we're going to get started. Jack, are you there?
I'm here.
Great. So my name's Annie Klodd. I'm an extension educator at University of Minnesota. My focus is fruit production, but you're not going to hear much from me today. Our speaker today is Jack Tillman. Jack is part of the fruit breeding program at University of Minnesota, works a lot with apple breeding, and is getting into cider apples as well. So we're really excited that Jack is going to talk today about cider apples in the Midwest, what varieties grow well here, as far as we know so far, and kind of what is cider and why are we growing cider apples, all those good things. And I'm going to start with just a couple minutes description of a new Minnesota cider apple grant funded project that we have. So I'll talk for a couple minutes and then I'll hand it over to Jack. If anybody has questions throughout any point in the presentation, there's an icon. If you put your cursor down in the bottom of your screen, there should be a bar that pops up at the bottom. It has a bunch of icons on it. One of them should say chat, and one of them should say Q&A. You can open up either of those and type in a question that you have. And at points throughout the presentation, we might pause to answer some of those questions, especially if they're urgent questions. And then we will also do plenty of question time at the end as well. All right, so you want to go to the next slide real quick, Jack? And then, all right. So the name of our grant-funded project is the Suitability of Minnesota Adapted and Traditional European Cider Apple Cultivars for Use in Minnesota Cider Production. So it's kind of a mouthful. You want to go to the next slide? Basically, what we're doing in this project is we're evaluating apple varieties at several orchards throughout the state of Minnesota, all the way up till north of Duluth. And what we want to do is look at both Minnesota adapted cultivars, like our University of Minnesota developed varieties, as well as European cider apple varieties that have been traditionally used for hard cider for a long time in countries like France and England, for instance. These are some of the collaborating orchards on the project. Next slide. The goal of the project is to begin developing some of that information that we really need in order to help Minnesota growers who would like to grow apples for cider, as well as cider makers throughout the Midwest who would like to use Minnesota apples for their cider. And this doesn't just go for Minnesota, it goes for Wisconsin, North Dakota, South Dakota, other states in the Midwest as well. But since we're getting state funding for this project, we are focusing the work in Minnesota. So we're going to be looking at, like I said, old world cultivars. Those are the old European varieties, as well as our Minnesota varieties. And then what we're going to do with this information, there's going to be a lot of great data that comes from this project, and we're going to do outreach from that, hopefully develop recommendations for variety selection and recommendations about how to grow these varieties that can help growers succeed. Next slide. So why study cider apples? Hopefully, if you're on this webinar today, you already feel like cider apples can be exciting. So we have over 22 hard cider producers in Minnesota. It's probably more than that, but this is the data that we have to work with right now, based on what the Minnesota Cider Guild has and a couple other cider sources online. Minnesota has a 51% rule for wine production, and cider falls under this category when we're talking about hard cider. What the 51% rule says is that anyone making wine out of Minnesota fruit has to use 51% of their fruit from the state of Minnesota. We are also interested in this project from an apple marketing standpoint. So if apples have blemishes on them, whether it be disease or insect damage, it can be hard to market those apples. But sometimes you can still make cider out of those apples that would be otherwise unmarketable. So it could open up a really good opportunity to get more revenue from those apples that you would otherwise not be able to sell. And Minnesota just has a climate as well as an industry that's really well suited for cider apples. We can grow a lot of varieties in our climate. We have a long history of apple production in the state. We have a really, really strong and lively craft beverage culture, not just in the Twin Cities, but throughout the state of Minnesota, as well as Wisconsin. And our apple industry is doing well, but there are also growers who are really interested in looking to use their apples in other new creative ways. So I think this is a great time for us to start looking into cider apples. But we need more information. We know that there are growers throughout the state who are growing some of these cider varieties, but we really need to study this question throughout the state and get some controlled data on how well these varieties grow throughout the state before we can give a lot of recommendations. Next slide. So here is a list of the old world or European varieties that we're using in the project. So these, it should be noted, these are already planted at each of the orchards that we're working with. The reason for that is the Minnesota Cider Guild, which at that point, the president of the Cider Guild was Gretchen Perbix at Sweetland Orchard. The Guild wrote a grant through the MDA Specialty Crop Block Grant to evaluate cider apples. And so they planted all of these varieties at different orchards throughout the state and are currently evaluating them for winter hardiness. So we're using those same apples and just expanding upon the data that we're going to get from those. Next slide. And these are the Minnesota hardy varieties that we are using in this study. So if you go to the next slide, these are our plans for what we're actually going to be looking at. So in the orchards with the old world European varieties, we're going to look at cold hardiness, the vigor, how well the trees grow, disease resistance, the timing of bloom and harvest, and the relative yield. In the research winery, we're going to be analyzing both those old world and the Minnesota adapted varieties that we already know a lot about in the orchard. We're going to look at fruit and juice qualities and then ferment that juice into cider and look at total acidity, pH, soluble solids, phenolics and tannins, and then do tasting panels for those. So Jack's going to go into more of what some of these words mean, but we're going to get a lot of really good data from this project. Next slide. What will come out of this work, we'll be producing a guide to producing and using cider apples in Minnesota. They can be updated as we learn more in the future, and we'll have recommendations for cider apple varieties that are really well suited for growing in our region, and recommendations for cider makers and winemakers for how to best use those varieties for cider. Next slide. So this is just step one in this project. There are a lot of future project ideas that we could explore, like best management practices for cold hardy cider apples, the economics of different trellis systems for these apples, and how to best use dropped or blemished apples in cider. So that's a really quick summary of the project that the grant-funded project that we have through Minnesota Department of Ag. And now I'm going to turn it over to Jack, and he's going to talk about some of these varieties that we're looking at.
Thanks, Annie. So as Annie said, my name is Jack Tillman, and I work for the University of Minnesota Apple Breeding Program. So I'm here on the St. Paul campus most of the time, but I'm out at our research orchards in Excelsior, Minnesota, a good deal of the time as well. And most of my job centers on breeding for cold hardy improved apple varieties. But one of the things that I get to do that's really fun is work with apple cider and cider varieties. So before we go too far, I want everybody to be on the same page. And so you'll hear the terms hard cider, sweet cider, and just regular cider frequently. And it turns out that we in Canada are the only countries in the world that use the term hard cider. And that started in the 1950s, post-prohibition. Apple juice makers wanted to reutilize the term cider. And so they called generally unfiltered pressed juice cider. And so now we're stuck dealing with the terms of hard and sweet cider. For the remainder of this talk, I'm going to be speaking about hard cider. That's a fermented product. It's alcoholic, can be pasteurized or unpasteurized, and the rest of the world simply calls this cider. So there are two major categories of cider styles in the world. And these are heritage and modern. Typically heritage ciders utilize either multi-use or cider-specific fruit. And these cider-specific varieties give complexity through flavor compounds or phenolics or tannins. And these are traditional in old world regions of the world. Modern cider utilizes dessert or culinary fruit, and it includes a wide variety of styles, but the through line is apple for the most part. And so the important take home from this is that apples define the style and not the region. You can have a heritage cider that comes from the United States or from Chile. You can have a modern cider that comes out of England or France. It is really the apples that are the through line. And so let's talk a little bit about the apples themselves. So the world of apples is divided into two broad categories. There's dessert fruit. These are the apples we're most familiar with. They're typically large, sweet, and intended to be eaten fresh. Cider fruit, on the other hand, comes in a wide variety of sizes, characteristics, flavors, and it's not intended to be eaten fresh, but to have its juice fermented. There's a third category that we're not going to get into at all today, and it's really kind of a historical footnote at this point, and those are baking or sauce fruit, and these just really don't have much of a place in apple production anymore. But just because an apple falls into one or more categories doesn't mean it can't be used for other purposes. There's another category that I don't have listed here, and it's really a hybrid of those two large apples there, and it's multi-use fruit. It's fruit that really has more than one best use. And we'll be getting into that a bit later. But for the time being, let's focus on cider fruit. So cider fruit themselves are divided into 4 subcategories based on the concentration of either acid or bitter compounds that are in the fruit. And so on the low end of both spectrums are sweets, and these are fruit which could potentially be dual purpose dessert or cider fruit. And then at the high end of both spectrums, you get bitter sharps, which along with bitter sweets are lumped into the old world spitter description of cider fruit. And so because the sugar content of fruit is strongly influenced by environmental and horticultural practices, we tend to look at ranges of acidity to define the differences between sweets and sharps. While it's entirely possible that any specific apple will give more or less sugar based on its genetics, it's really the acidity that we're focused on. And so if we think about this scale, we could call it a spectrum, it provides a framework for us to think about different cider apples and where they might fit into a blend. So while there are some really fine single varietal ciders out there, more frequently varietals are blended, and we can use this framework to think about how we would want to put together what you might call notes. And so you might need a base of some sweets and some sours in order to build up volume, provide some nice bright acidity, and you might want just a handful of bitter notes in there, and you might want to use some of them to adjust the final alcohol that's in the beverage or acidity. And so if we think about where we want to be pulling our source fruit from, we can then think about the apples that might do this for us. And now, I don't want to give anyone false impression that this is exactly where these things fall. This is my impression of where I would place all of these varieties on a spectrum. But as you can see, there's some interesting things here, including dessert varieties, which certainly have their place in fermented cider. And if you remember, I mentioned before that one of the things that is going to be important is multi-use fruit. Well, this is what I'm talking about when I talk about multi-use fruit. They tend to span the region between sweets and sours, and it's their ability to go both ways, to be both palatable as a fresh eating fruit, but also to provide good balance in a fermented beverage, as well as good flavor notes. That's important when we start thinking about cider, especially here in the upper Midwest. So where did all of these fruits come from? So, I mean, really, it's mostly Europe. And when we think about cider in Europe, it's really three major regions. So the first of these is English. English cider is an important source of many of the cider-specific varieties grown around the world, and is especially important when it comes to the varieties that we included in our grant. And if you remember back to the slide that Annie put up, most of those cider-specific varieties came out of England. But it's important to recognize that England isn't a monolith, and that there are two distinct regions within England, if not more. In the east of the country, they make what we might carefully call modern cider using dessert or multi-purpose fruit. But when people think of England, they're mostly thinking of the west of the country, and specifically Herefordshire and Somerset. And this is the source for a lot of the famous cider fruit. You might know some of them like Kingston Black or Yarlington Mill, or even Dabinet. However, like most things English, if you look back far enough, you find a little bit of French ancestry. And so it turns out that Dabinet has at least one French parent, which takes us to France. And French cider is traditionally from the north of the country. There's two main regions: Brittany, the furthest to the west, and Normandy, which is kind of directly below England. And then there are some minor regions over towards the Jura, which is in the east of the country, and then in the southwest of the country in the Pyrenees. And the styles in France are a little bit more varied than what you get out of the west of England. They go all the way from sweet to dry. And a major difference between England and France is that France uses the AOC system. And this is the system that they use to control almost all of their agricultural products, provides a framework under which they guarantee quality and regional specificity. And this is important because in cider, as with wine, they control which varieties are able to go into these ciders. And so there are many old traditional varieties that are integrated into their cider culture, but not to the same degree that cider is integrated into Spanish culture. So no place on earth has cider woven into its culture and daily life like Spain's cider regions in the north. And these are Asturias, Cantabria, and Basque. So here, cider is the everyday beverage of life, but it is a social beverage. It's not something you would ever pour for yourself. You'd certainly never find yourself sitting at home sipping a small glass of cider. Typically, cider is produced there in large chestnut barrels, and there are certainly traditional Spanish varieties, but regional importance of variety is kind of downplayed, as producers there houses source fruit from all over Europe. They're getting fruit from France and Italy and Switzerland, and they're blending them into their house style. And so I mentioned the large chestnut barrels that they're fermented in. This is the source of most of Spanish cider style and flavor. And so maintaining these barrels provides for a consistent product, and it also is one of the sources for the acetic acid bacteria that produce the typical 1 to 2% acetic acid character. So I don't, as you can see here, have any varieties listed. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is that the Spanish do diminish to a certain degree the importance of their cider varietals. At the same time, not a lot of them are available, at least as true to type cultivars within the United States. And then on top of that, I'm just not very familiar with them. So if people have lots of questions about Spanish cider varieties, I can certainly direct you to sources that might have answers for you, but I'm not necessarily going to be able to do that. The last note I'll make is is if you are interested in making Spanish style cider, it is a heavily cultural product. And so you need to be at a minimum aware of cultural appropriation, and that making something in a flattering cider, Spanish cider-like style is probably a better approach than making Cidra itself. So we went through the three major regions, but they're not the only sources for cider apples in the world. There are others, several European ones, Germany, Poland, Austria, and others. But in addition to that, there's also the Southern Hemisphere. And cider apple regions in the Southern Hemisphere really are dominated by Australia and New Zealand. South America produces a lot of apples, but not a lot of cider. But the English colonial history in Australia and New Zealand mean that English varietals really dominate in both Australia and New Zealand. And because they're relatively new regions, there isn't a lot of new varieties out there coming from this part of the world. And they haven't had much time to develop their own styles. So that leaves us with North America. And for the purposes today, I'm going to speak of North America mostly as the United States. So US varieties originated the same way that every other New World region originated, basically with European imports. So as a result, almost all of the fruit here is also derived from French and English varieties. However, a big difference here is that the amount of time that's passed since Old World varieties made their way over has provided for a lot more variation. Cider really becomes prominent in the 1700s, but immigration had been happening into the continent for almost 200 years at that point. And so there has been a lot of time in the United States for seedlings to have been planted out, and these seedlings to become new trees and varieties. So the passage of time allows for seedlings or pippins to grow up and be evaluated. And the more generations you have, the more chances you have for distinct varietals to arise. In addition to the passage of time, one of the unique characteristics of cider in the United States is settler movement into depeopled lands. So John Chapman, the famous Johnny Appleseed, plays a surprisingly large role in this. While he's certainly a fun story to talk about, he does spread apples across the Ohio River Valley. And Johnny Appleseed was a Swedenborgian, and Swedenborgians didn't believe in grafting, so every tree that he planted out came from a seed. And he was a bit of an entrepreneur, and he'd travel ahead of settlers, set up a small orchard, and then sell trees when the settlers arrived. And over time, these seedling orchards grow up and increase in their importance to a degree that we really become a country of cider drinkers. And its importance can't really be understated. Some of it has to do with access to clean drinking water, which was certainly important. But I think also all of us, right, just enjoy occasionally drinking a glass of cider. And so this all came to a head, about 100 years ago. In fact, the day that I was hoping to give this talk happened to have been the 100th anniversary of the beginning of Prohibition. But one shouldn't put too much emphasis on the beginning of Prohibition. Cider had already begun to decline before Prohibition came into effect. In fact, changing tastes, notably a move towards whiskey, and urbanization that allowed for cleaner drinking water, had already pushed cider back from being the most important beverage in the United States. Nonetheless, Prohibition had its effect. And so thanks to Prohibition, we largely lost all of these seedling orchards. They were either left to disuse, they were cut down and replanted with dessert varieties. Either way, it was a death knell for most of this variation. And most of these orchards being gone, we lost the seedlings as well. So what we were left with was orchards that contained multi-use varieties. This isn't to say that there aren't cider-specific varieties within the United States, but the really prominent varieties that we're left with tend to be multi-use. You might know these as Roxbury Russet or Northern Spy or Golden Russet. But multi-use is not a bad thing, as I keep saying. So multi-use can produce a great cider product. England, in fact, like I have mentioned, has been doing it for years. And so cider fruit that's grown for both fresh eating and cider has the advantage of being a value-added product, and it just becomes a natural use for this non-marketable fruit. So, as Annie stated before, this is a major goal of what we would like to do. We would like to take a look at some of these varieties that we know do well in Minnesota, which is still a challenging landscape for apples, and take a look at their potential within cider. So I'm going to take the next several slides to go over the varieties that have been included, some of the attributes that we have information on, highlight some of the things that we don't yet know and that we're hoping to get out of this talk. But just as a brief overview, there were 17 varieties of dessert or multi-use fruit that were included in the grant. There are 9 dessert cultivars, there are 5 crabs, 2 unreleased selections, and 1 potential northern cider variety. And these were chosen for a variety of reasons. Prime amongst them is that they needed to be hardy. They need to be things that we know survive here. But they also need to be things that we think we can get enough fruit to do our tests and analyses on. We also wanted to make sure to include things that are widely planted across the state. These are things that already probably have some volume of fruit that's being directed to pressing, and if people can get their hands on that right away, that's a nice little head start. We also wanted to include things that we thought had the potential to make interesting cider. We have, for the last couple of years, been doing some small-scale cider work out at the research center. Nothing to the degree that we're going to be doing with this grant, but we thought that we could take some of the things that we've learned and apply it to this new grant. So in addition to that, we also want them to potentially serve as a valuable base for blending. As I mentioned before, most ciders are a blend of different fruits, and as a result, you can use some things that you might not necessarily think make the most interesting cider on their own, but add a nice essential note to whatever your blend is. So we're going to start with something that everyone is probably quite familiar with, and that's Honeycrisp. Couple of the things that it has going for it is it's very widely planted across the state, and it has extremely valuable name recognition. There's nothing terribly remarkable about its chemistry. It makes a valuable cider base, and like I said, it does have some marketing potential. So another of the fruits that was included is Zestar. So Zestar, again, is widely planted. It tends to have relatively flavorful juice, and we've found with our cider trials that it does have some minor tannin character, which is also really nice. You can see it has slightly higher total acidity and is a relatively early fruit. Next is Sweet Tango, also known as Miniska, for the fruit that aren't able to be marketed as whole fruit. So again, it's widely planted in the state. We know it's hardy. Oh, I should have mentioned, sorry, I'm gonna go back and mention this. Zestar is also probably the hardiest fruit that the high quality dessert fruit that the University of Minnesota has released. And so one of its benefits is that it does pretty well even at zone 3. Sorry, back to Sweet Tango, Miniska. Again, widely planted and can give valuable name recognition. One of the other attributes it has is that it's relatively high in sugar, gives a good juice yield. In addition to that, because it has a grading standard associated with it, there's already a volume of juice that has to be produced out there. The next dessert variety that we're including is Snow Sweet. It's notable for its flavor alone. It has a lovely floral characteristic. It also has some minor scab resistance. Next is Frostbite. I don't have a lot of notes here about Frostbite. Frostbite has a tendency to be a bit of a divisive cultivar. It's been around in the program for a very long time, and it has a very unique flavor. And I've anecdotally heard some cider makers who love producing cider from it, think it makes a really interesting cider. I know people who don't want to get anywhere near Frostbite fruit. It's one of those things we'd like to find out. Does it lend itself in tasting panels to making high quality cider? The next fruit we have is Haralson. Like a lot of these, it is widely planted in the state, probably not to the same degree that it was some time ago, but it also has valuable name recognition, at least within the state. I'm not sure how far the fan club of Haralson extends outside of our borders, but within the state, it's widely recognized. An advantage that Haralson has is that if we're thinking about where it falls in terms of what notes it brings to cider, it is relatively high in acid. So you can see the 7.2 grams per liter malic acid equivalent there. Haralson is probably the closest we have to a sharp included in these Minnesota adapted varieties, and can be a really nice source of acidity, especially if as a grower, you're letting some of this fruit hang for a while in order to develop flavor and sugar. You're naturally going to have a drop in acid throughout that time. And rather than having a flabby cider, an inclusion of some Haralson in there will probably keep your acidity in a stable range, something that's palatable, something that ferments well and doesn't risk secondary infection. The next variety is Keepsake, another University of Minnesota release. Keepsake's notable for its nice aromatic flavor, and it's also high in sugar and very durable. This is fruit that's harvested quite late in the season and can store extremely well. Works well if you're pressing a lot of fruit. You can put your Keepsake away and not have to worry about coming back to it. Next variety is Regent. We included Regent because it did well in the small scale tasting panels that we had done in the past. Tasters noted its rich aromatic flavor, lots of notes of spice, baking spice, warm mulled spices. And so we thought it warranted further investigation. Used to be an extremely popular variety in the state. I'm not sure how widely planted it is any longer. And finally, the last dessert variety that I'm going to go over is Sweet 16. Sweet 16 is a mid-season fruit, noted for its distinct cherry-like flavor. And you'll note that it is really quite low acidity. And this is another one of those things that you'll want to think about when including something like this, is that you'll probably need an acid source. 3.5 isn't the worst pH, but it's starting to push you into a dangerous range for fermentation. And so if you're really letting your Sweet 16 hang for a long time in order to develop flavor, you're probably going to want another source of acid in that blend. So the first of the crab varieties is Centennial Crab. This again is a U of M release. It's extremely early. We've noted some tannin character in it, and like all of the crabs, it's very hardy. You'll notice we don't have any chemistry data for this. Though it was released by the university in the 1950s, we haven't done a lot with crab-apple crossing in the intervening time, and we don't have a lot of data as a result, at least not enough that I can present a reasonable average for you. So one of the things that we're looking to do over the course of this grant period is to develop that fundamental information that you as cider growers and makers can use. Next crab variety is Whitney crab. Like Centennial, it's extremely early and again has some tannin character noted in it. It's also extremely hardy. This one comes out of Illinois from the mid 1800s. Whitney is a little bit drier than Centennial, but there is a little bit more astringency or tannin character in it probably. And again, we'll be working to develop information for chemistry for Whitney crab. Rescue crab is an extremely hardy crab apple. It's a Ag Canada release out of Saskatchewan, so it's hardy to at least zone 3, and I've read some anecdotes of hardiness into zone 2. Again, it's early. That's part of the reason it does well, is that it's right before things freeze up. Again, we'll be looking to generate some more information there. Chestnut crab. So chestnut crab is a University of Minnesota release, and it's noted for its nutty, distinctive character. It is also an extremely well-regarded cider apple regionally, and to a certain degree, even nationally. I've talked to many cider makers who think that chestnut crab could be a founding apple for Minnesota-specific cider. It's got high acid. If you let it hang long enough, it's got high sugar. If you let it hang, its acidity comes down. 9.6 grams per liter is probably harvested relatively early compared to where an average cider maker would harvest it. It is an all-around good apple for making cider. And our final crab here is cur crab, which is another Ag Canada release from the 1950s. It's a cross between Dolgo crabapple and Haralson, and it has an extremely distinct aromatic flavor. I would describe it as rose petal. Like the other Ag Canada release, it is extremely hardy, at least zone 3, if not potentially into zone 2. And it has a mid-season ripening, but it hangs on the tree extremely well. And as a result, it drops its acid over a course of a couple of weeks. The flavor seems to hold up extremely well during that period of time, so you're not risking the loss of that lovely flavor, but you do drop the acidity down into a more balanced range, and it makes truly lovely cider. One of my favorite fruits that we've made cider from. A new one for us is Rhinet russet, and this is a sport of Rhine de Rhinettes, which is also known as King of the Pippins. It's an old French dessert variety, and this is a sport that was identified in France and brought over to Canada for testing, and the Canadians released it in the mid-70s. At least that's the best information I can come up with for it, is that its release date is somewhere in that range. It should be hardy, it seems to be. We're interested to see how well it does over the course of the grant period. We're interested to generate some chemistry data, but also some tasting data on it, since it anecdotally should have some interesting bitter characteristics that most of the rest of these fruit do not.
Hey, Jack, one real quick question we had.
Yes.
Since you said the word bitter, a question from a while back in the presentation. Someone asked, when you say bitter, are these apples actually bitter, or are they more likely astringent with high tannins?
Well, they can be either. There are a number of different classes of compounds in apples that can give either bitterness or astringency. Some of them give both. Astringency is technically a texture. It's when phenolic compounds bind to the inside of your mouth. And so when we talk about spitters, we're really talking about both of those things. And they vary in their content by variety. They vary in their content by season. These are, after all, agricultural crops, and environment plays a big component. I can't with any confidence say one way or the other about any one of these varieties. I know that when we ferment Zestar, we do get a hint of bitterness in there, but we don't get astringency. When we start talking about some of these fruit that I have less experience with, like Rhinet russet, I don't for sure know whether we're talking about astringency or bitterness. When we talk about these things in cider as being positive characteristics, they're adding complexity. They're also being broken down by the yeast during the course of fermentation and creating secondary metabolites, which give increased aroma, different flavors. They're one of the things that's lending themselves to those extremely complex overall profiles, which isn't to say that that's for everybody. I think one of the things that people struggle with is thinking that we always need to push towards making our ciders in some specific style because it's what somebody else does. I think that there's certainly a place for bitter and astringent apples making complex cider, and there's also a place for refreshing, easy drinking, modern cider styles.
Thank you.
So MN 1734, this is a hearty, heavily russeted, flavorful University of Minnesota selection. It's technically unreleased, though it is available if you look around hard enough out there. This picture actually comes from a Canadian nursery that sells it. Again, we haven't done much with it in the course of the last several decades and don't have much in the way of chemistry data. So we're hoping that we can generate some of that information, and we think it's a promising enough selection that it might go on to be released, with the thought being that people would want to use it in cider production. And lastly, the last variety I'm going to go over in any detail is MN 1980. So this is a hearty dessert variety. It's on its way to being the most recent University of Minnesota release. It carries two scab resistance genes. It carries VF, which is a scab resistance gene from a crabapple, and it carries the scab resistance gene that Honeycrisp has. It's flavorful and with a nice texture. It's a mid-late, basically a Honeycrisp season fruit, and we think that it has good potential in cider, not only based on flavor characteristics, but also because of that durable scab resistance that it carries should hopefully allow it to be on at least a reduced spray program. And so the trees for this fruit are coming available in 2021. If people are interested, they should contact David Bedford at the Horticultural Research Center, and I believe there are orders going out for this relatively soon. So I just went through all of the multi-use, but mostly dessert varieties that are included on the grant. And I'm sure all of you are saying, but we're here to learn about cider varieties. And the one thing I can say assuredly is that there are no verifiably Minnesota hardy cider specific varieties. And that's not to say that there haven't been dozens of varieties tested within the state. I just don't have the data to back it up to say that, yes, you should plant this thing. We know that it survives under these conditions. But this is one of the reasons that we're doing the grant, is we want to look at some of these mostly English cider varieties that are already in the ground thanks to the Cider Guild's previous work. So you saw this list earlier. Annie mentioned it, that these are the cider varieties that are included. We have some bittersweets, Bulmer's Norman, Chisel Jersey, Dabinet, Harry Masters Jersey, Major, Yarlington Mill, Bitter Sharps, Foxwell, Kingston Black, Porter's Perfection, and Tremlets, and then some Sharps, Ashmeads, and Browns. I guess I should note that Ashmeads is really more of a multi-purpose apple. Its origin is England in the 1700s as an actual fresh-eating dessert fruit, but it makes a truly interesting cider. I don't have a lot of information about these. That's why I'm not presenting them individually. I know the characteristics of each of these from fruit grown elsewhere, but not grown in the state of Minnesota. And so we're hoping over the course of this grant that we're going to generate data that will let us know which of these are going to do better than others. We know anecdotally that people have struggled to grow Dabinet, but outside of that, I don't have a lot of information. I should note that the varieties that have the double dagger on them, Foxwhelp, Tremlets Bitter, and Browns, are potentially not true to type. And that's not to say that there's a mistake with our trees. These are trees that that have things circulating under their name, but are probably not true to their ancestral type over in England. In fact, we know based on one of our more recent DNA marker tests that Tremlets Bitter is very unlikely to be the actual Tremlets Bitter. The only verified Tremlets Bitter in the country is in quarantine at APHIS, and the rest of them are probably better referred to as Geneva Tremlets. And we know also that there are a number of things circulating as Foxwhelp, and that there's some confusion about Browns. And so know that when you're buying these things, it's worth asking what the provenance of everybody's cider varieties are. Some of them are pretty consistent. Ashmeads is pretty hard to confuse. There's a lot of people out there growing Dabinet and things like Chisel Jersey, but some of these other varieties, there is the potential that they are not what they say they are. And so while I said that we don't have any verifiable varieties, what specifically are we doing? Well, we're going to work to generate as much useful information as we can. First is hardiness. Do these things survive? We're not going to have decades of data, but we're hoping that the 3 to 5 years of information we'll have based on the previous grant and then our current grant will give us an idea of which of these do better than others. We'd like to have some information about vigor, and we'll be visiting these orchards and collecting data on trunk cross-sectional area and overall growth. When we get fruit from them, which we don't anticipate to necessarily be this next year, but we could get lucky, we intend to collect it and ferment it, and then that fruit or that finished cider will go off to a tasting panel, and that tasting panel will generate some interesting notes that we hope that people find useful. In addition, we're going to be doing chemical analysis of that, and so we'll generate the data that I presented for those dessert varieties, that being degrees Brix, total acidity, and pH. But in addition to that, we'll also be generating information on tannins, and I'm pretty excited about the new test that we're going to use. In the past, we've used a test that doesn't seem to be particularly well correlated with one's perception. It binds tannins, but not necessarily in the same way that the tannins bind to the inside of our mouth. And so this new test was developed in Australia for their wine industry, and it is supposed to do a better job of correlating human perception with the actual test results. And so I'm very hopeful there. And then in addition to this, we are also going to run HPLC, which stands for high performance liquid chromatography. Really what it is a fancy way of breaking up the juice or the fermented cider into its individual parts. And from that, we should be able to know things like individual sugars, individual acids. We should also know things that are important to cider makers like yeast assimilable nitrogen and the like. And so we're really excited about some of the data that we're going to be generating, and we are really hopeful that you will all find it useful. But so if we don't have bittersweets and bitter sharps growing in Minnesota, and we don't even have a lot of the multi-purpose varieties that people want growing, what are cider makers in the state doing for those? And so I was curious about this and put together a small survey, sent it out to cider makers in the state, to find out what are they buying from outside of the state. And so I got about a quarter of the people who received the survey responded. And of those, 2/3 said that they bought fruit that was not grown in the state of Minnesota in the last 3 years. And so what was that fruit, and is it possible that that could be sourced from in the state? And so it turns out that it's a pretty interesting mix of things. Those cider makers that responded that also bought out-of-state fruit bought in about 28,500 bushels of fruit or equivalent juice. They responded in either bushel or gallons of juice, and I used 3 gallons per bushel as a conversion. And so, yes, there was some what you would almost call commodity dessert juice or fruit being bought, but it didn't make up a majority of it. In fact, it made up about the same proportion of fruit being bought in that is cider fruit. And so it turns out that the biggest proportion of out-of-state fruit amongst the respondents is multi-use fruit. And this included some golden russet, some northern spy, some other varieties, and the cider varieties, again, what you would expect, they're buying in bittersweets and bitter sharps. And so we hope that eventually we can supply that from within the state, but we'll see. So the last thing I wanted to bring up before I close and answer some questions was cider roundtables. So last year we started roundtable discussions for commercial cider makers within the state. And so this is open to any commercial cider maker or aspiring commercial cider maker if the cidery is in the planning, is well along, let's say beyond the planning stages. And so these are open forum discussions that center on a specific topic. The 2019 topics were seasonal variation, and single varietal or cultivar-driven ciders. So I'm going to be sending out an invitation this week to our upcoming roundtable that's going to happen in the next month. And at the same time, I'll be sending out a list of the other roundtables that'll happen throughout the year. So if you'd like to be a part of this, please don't hesitate to send me an email and I'll get you included on the mailing list. If you've already gotten emails from me, don't worry, you'll continue to do so. So before I end, I wanted to say thank you to some people who really make all of this happen. Dr. Jim Luby is the fruit breeder here at the University of Minnesota, and he provides me the opportunity to do interesting things like work with cider. David Bedford is the breeder at the Horticultural Research Center who's on the ground working with these varieties all the time. And then Dr. Clark and Drew Horton from the Grape Breeding and Enology program provide the cider making expertise and all sorts of other help. And obviously I couldn't do any of this work without the HRC Apple crew who do the hard work of actually growing and maintaining this stuff so that we have access to good quality research fruit. And then finally, I'd like to thank all of the Luby Clark lab members, staff, grad students, undergraduates who are invaluable in helping out with all of this stuff. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions that people might have.
All right, we got a number of good questions, so we'll try to get through all of these, and if you have more questions, please type them in the chat box. I know that both of us can stay past 1 o'clock for anybody who has more questions. So I'll ask this one first because I think it might be a shorter question for you to answer. Can you mix in other fruit with apples and still market it as cider?
Yes, you can. I don't know how much you can do legally. I don't know what the thresholds are, but yes, absolutely. You can mix in other things and still call it cider. It falls under the modern cider category. I can't remember specifically what they call it. You can go to the American Cider Association's website and look all this up. But you can add fruit adjuncts. You can add things like hops. You can add spices. I actually had a very interesting cayenne cider that I can't say I wanted to drink a lot of, but was more interesting than I expected. So there are lots of things that you can add to cider and still market it as cider.
A lot of people will add sour cherries, which we can grow well in Minnesota. Aronia is a crop that we have a pretty large supply of. If anybody's interested in using that, I know of some Aronia growers throughout the state. Rhubarb is another thing I've seen. Obviously, pears. Another question, what is provenance? You said that word earlier in the presentation.
Provenance. So when I was mentioning provenance, I was saying when you're sourcing your trees, you should be careful what their provenance is. And when I say that, I mean that you should ask whoever the nursery is where they got their breeding stock from. This is important in cider fruit because there are so many seedlings of propagated as the actual thing. There's just there's a lot of confusion out there for some of these English cider varieties. And I don't know as much about the French varieties, but it wouldn't surprise me if it's the same issue there. So really what you want to do is ask them. And if they don't know, that should kind of be a red flag. There are repositories that people can get things from. There are some very good, knowledgeable growers out there who have sourced this stuff and have taken careful notes about where they've gotten their stuff from, and that should be trustworthy. But if whoever you're buying this from doesn't know, I would be cautious that it is what they say it is.
Okay, thanks. Jim Luby made a comment about MN 1980 apple trees. He says MN 1980 trees can be ordered from 3 nurseries for budding in 2020. One of those is Cameron Nursery. And then Gold Crown Nursery in Washington and Moser in Michigan as well are sources of the 1980 apple. Speaking of nurseries, someone asked what nurseries can we buy a lot of these varieties from? Thinking of most of the varieties that you went into detail on in the presentation. Can you answer that question? I mean, I often, I'm supposed to stay away from recommending specific places as in my role in extension.
I don't have any good sources for most of these. I would suggest talking to other growers within the Growers Association if you're trying to source some of the more difficult to find ones. I'm guessing some of the crabs that aren't grown as frequently might be a little difficult to source. But I don't have any specific nursery in mind.
So a lot of the people who are attending this webinar aren't currently growing apples. So just generally, I'm not endorsing anyone, but Adams County Nursery in Pennsylvania and Commons Orchard are 2 common places where people like to source trees from. Okay, so somebody earlier in the presentation commented about food safety concerns. Are there any risks to having livestock in the orchard, and does E. coli survive during fermentation, or does it die during fermentation? Fermentation is considered a kill step, and anybody who's producing any sort of specialty crop for direct market in Minnesota should be attending the food safety certification courses that are offered about 15 times throughout the year in the state of Minnesota. So any sort of food safety questions, I always say, talk to our food safety coordinators at University of Minnesota Extension because they have a wealth of knowledge about this, and attend those courses. They're highly advertised. They're highly available throughout the state. And be careful if you are thinking about having any sort of livestock, even chickens in your orchard, because they do become a significant food safety concern, even with that kill step. There was a question about dogo crabs. Were dogo crabs included in the study? If not, why?
Dolgo was not included. Cur is an offspring of Dolgo. Dolgo was not included because I don't have a good source of fruit for Dolgo, and have limited experience with it as a result. We found that Cur is a really wonderful crab, and we had to make a cutoff step somewhere. So its genetics are in there, and I know that there are some fans of Dolgo crab cider. I just have very limited experience with it.
What is the most common rootstock to use in commercial orchards in northern climates?
There's a lot of answers to that question. I would strongly recommend talking with whoever you are ordering your trees from about what rootstocks they offer, and they will have pretty good idea of which ones should be suitable to your site. Know that there are rootstocks that are not hardy in Minnesota, and there are some that are. Rather than giving off a huge rundown of rootstocks, if you have a specific question, by all means, send me an email. Otherwise, there are some rootstock experts around that you could ask.
I've gotten a lot of questions from growers about rootstocks lately too, and so I'm thinking I'll write an article for the newsletter soon that shows different resources where people can go and compare rootstocks, because there is so much information about this topic and it can get complex. Jack was saying, yeah, talk to the nursery and they can talk to you about your site and which ones would be most suitable. And I would agree with that. I know that B9 is very common in Minnesota, for instance, but that doesn't mean that B9 is going to be the best choice for your site, especially if you're on sandier soil, something with less water holding capacity, for instance. So I will put out an article about that. Our newsletter is called UMN Extension Fruit and Vegetable News. That's the best place for us to get information out on things like that. What other questions do people have? It is past 1, so if you want to hang out and ask more questions, feel free. But otherwise, thank you so much for attending. And this will be recorded and posted on the UMN Extension Fruit and Vegetable News blog. And I will also email the recording out to everyone who attended. And thank you, Jack, so much for doing this today.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Does anybody have any other questions?
There was a question that I forgot to ask from Bill. He says, what yeast is best for fermentation? Another complex question.
Yes, this is a very complex question. I can tell you that for the grant, we will be using one yeast to reduce the complexity of the data that we're going to look at. We're using Sensi, which is a Scott Labs product. There is also a yeast out there called Safe Cider, which I believe is from Fermentus, that has some following. I know that DV10 is also just a very popular yeast amongst cider makers, and that is a real workhorse in the wine industry.
Jim Luby says there is some rootstock information available on fruit.umn.edu. Kathy asks, do people make varietal cider or always blend during fermentation? Otherwise, how do you deal with different timings of ripening?
So oftentimes cider is produced as a single fermented product and then blended afterwards. If you happen to be pressing two things one day, there's nothing that would stop you from say mixing two varieties together. But it seems to be standard practice to ferment singly as opposed to co-ferment.
Any commercial Minnesota orchards growing ambrosia apples that you know of? Does it make good cider?
I don't know of anybody growing ambrosia. I'd be curious to know if it's hardy here, but I would recommend asking around. I would guess that the apple growers have a chat or forum that you might be able to post that question in, because I don't personally know of anybody who does.
If you're a member of the Minnesota Apple Growers Association, I know that they have a listserv as well as a Facebook group that you could ask that on. Otherwise, there's also the Organic Fruit Growers Association that has a good social media and email network, so you can ask that question there as well if you're a member of that group. Any other questions? Feel free to type them in the chat box.
Well, if that's it, I'll hang out here for another minute or two to see if somebody happens to be typing. But otherwise, I appreciate everybody listening. And if something comes up, please feel free to send me an email. My email was at the end of that presentation.
What is your email? I'll type it in the chat box.
TILL0068 at uniform Mike November Echo Delta Uniform.
Thanks. And my email is, I just typed it in as well. This photo on the last slide is from our research winery. You and Drew put all those together a couple weeks, right?
Yeah, so those were actually racked today. Racking means that they're finished fermenting. The yeast cells have settled to the bottom, and we carefully pour the clear cider off the top. They're no longer juice. They're finished fermenting, and they're now cider. So those will sit for another couple of weeks in a cold room to settle a little bit further, and then they'll be bottled and ready for analysis and tasting.
Yep. So we'll get 3 seasons of data, basically replicating it over 3 years. It's important to do that because then we're able to consider things like environmental or climate variation from year to year.
Yeah, and this year was a little ad hoc. There's some things included that we didn't mention in the talk and may or may not get included in the future, but we included as much as we could before we get into next year's full season.
Hey, we got another question. Maybe this will be the last one unless somebody types another question while we're answering this one. Did you use any additives like yeast, nutrients, or pectic enzymes?
Yes, we used pectic enzyme and we always have, though going forward, we got really clear juice off of Gretchen's rack and cloth press, and I'm not sure we're gonna continue to need to use pectic enzyme as a result. We always add nutrient, which is Fermade K, I believe is what we've been using. I'll have to double check that with Drew. I believe it's Fermade K. We found that cider just needs prophylactic nutrient treatments, that it has a strong tendency to produce SO2 if it's not well fed. The yeast that we use, Sensi, is a low or no SO2 producing yeast, but we can still have some issues with that if we don't just treat them every other day or so.
Okay. There are still 20 people hanging out, but I don't see. Okay, one more question. Do you have any further information on the tannin testing being done in Australia?
Okay, so we're using the methylcellulose precipitation assay, which what it does is the tannins in the sample will bind with methylcellulose and precipitate out of solution, which is similar to what they're doing inside of your mouth. They're binding to your taste buds on your tongue and the sides of your mouth in terms of astringency, and removing themselves from solution. So what we do is we look at a mixture of our cider and methylcellulose, and we take a picture of that on a spectrophotometer and get a reading with all of that methylcellulose in suspension. And then we add, and then we let it sit and wait and react, and we take another picture again, and the tannins and phenolics that have bound to methylcellulose become no longer soluble and fall to the bottom of the container. And so what happens is we get a clearing at the specific wavelength that we're monitoring and are able to use a standard curve to relate that to tannin or phenolic concentration within the sample. Sounds a bit like a mouthful. If you would like to read more, look up methylcellulose precipitation assay. It's a protocol that was developed in Australia in the, I want to say, late 80s or early 90s.
Okay. Well, thank you, Jack.
It was my pleasure to be here. I appreciate everyone listening.
All right. Thank you, everyone. The recording will be posted within a couple days and emailed out. Have a great rest of your day.
All right, bye-bye.